Fellow St. Lucians, this is Open Mic. We're back now to the second segment of our program. When we left off, I was just posing a question to Richard because I'm particularly concerned of the manner in which the banks have been working with us lately, but which is understandable because they had a lot of bad debt on their hand and they're being very cautious. But they have tons of money in their vaults, which they want to lend, but they don't want to make the same mistake twice. So I'm just posing a question to Richard. What is his take on the whole situation as far as the banks are concerned? While the grass is growing, the horse is starving. So can you see the banks being any more liberal than they are now, knowing that this is about to take place?
Well, we certainly don't want to have hungry horses.
Yeah.
The issue isn't just the fact that banks are being more conservative. I think everyone globally, all banks have learned their lessons in respect of lending when in fact all the evidence pointed to the fact that the people they were lending to were not going to be able to repay, or ensuring that you were in a position to recover your security when the time came. So globally, banks have tightened up, and so now we have a kind of a pool of liquidity all over the world that results in the fact that if you put a deposit of money in Switzerland, you get a negative interest rate. And so with all of that in mind, that if it was only the issue that banks were being a little more conservative and cautious, then you will find that eventually, as the economy started to grow, and the projects that came forward to the banks for lending look stronger. They would be in a position to lend the monies out.
Yeah.
But the fact that in St. Lucia, for example, we have these inhibitions, these restrictions in respect of being able to recover your security, effectively makes the interest rate that much higher because of the risk involved.
Right.
And the reluctance of banks to lend because of the risks involved. So that if you remove these risks, then they are more willing, because what they say is, okay, I'll take a chance. Everything looks good, but like everything else, things may go wrong. If it does, I now know that I can go to court, I can get my security, I can resell it, and I can have the money to recover my loan and to lend that money out to someone else.
Now, we have spoken about the banking side, Richard. Now, let us look at the political side of it. As you can well imagine, there are a certain percentage of people who knowingly defraud the banks because they know from day one it can't pay. Politically, how do you think the governments are going to react to the fact that, hey, you don't pay, that thing within X months is going to be taken? Now, the reason for asking that question, because listening to Parliament on television, Philip Pierre made a statement, and he said, well, he wonders whether some sort of an agreement can be put in place so that individuals who borrow $100,000 and less will not be susceptible to the full brunt of that law, but people over 100,000. I didn't think that was quite smart, because really and truly, people have to understand, people who make money have to work for their money too. And we once were $100,000 bracket people. If we have gone to a $300,000, that should not show any difference. Do you see that the population or the citizens fighting that law in any way or being against it?
Well, the first thing is that politicians sometimes need to keep their noses out of business.
Right.
And they basically set the overall legislative environment and framework, and then let the private sector organizations implement. And not try to get involved, in a sense, if they had any influence, trying to tell a bank, oh, don't pull the plug on this project, don't do this and that. And this is what they're trying to do now, and to a large extent it's good because it's taking it out of the hands of, let's say, national governments and putting it on a more regional basis, creating an asset management company that is going to take all of the bad loans and put it on one balance sheet. What they give back in return to the banks is another interesting story. And then that company would be in a better position in terms of the marketing of the properties, the valuation of the properties, and turning the properties around if it is possible to make it more successful. The issue, though, in not so much in the big companies, because with big companies, banks can seize and sell. A mortgage debenture allows you to appoint a receiver. He can go in, he can sell within a month or two.
Right.
So that's not the issue. The issue is really mortgages where you cannot appoint a receiver.
Right.
And that is where some caution needs to take place, because if the banks are too aggressive, and if they want to seize and sell someone's house because they've missed 3 payments, clearly there are going to be situations in which, because of a slowdown in the economy, a lot of people cannot pay on time. And you don't want good people being thrown out on the street.
Right.
And I think, to be fair to Mr. Peer, what his concern is about those who, for whatever reason, and he's using the 100,000 threshold, might find themselves in a problem, and whether they could be thrown out of their homes or lose their businesses as a result. You can't do it that way.
Yeah.
I think the Prime Minister a couple of years ago mentioned something else at the Monetary Council meeting that was along the lines that if someone had paid 75% of the mortgage on their house, that consideration should be given in a situation like that. And I think that is a better benchmark. But even that has its own difficulties.
Definitely.
Because every now and again you're going to get out and out scams. And if it's a scam, whether it's 100,000 or under, whether it's 75% or more,
that's right.
There's
He's
no
going to
way.
use it.
They have to use it, right? And so it's the bank's ability to do the due diligence on the people they lend money to be able to distinguish between one and the other.
Yeah.
But it does help to have some benchmarks to say, in those circumstances, you give people not a break. You don't wipe off 25%, but at least you allow a little more. But it's very difficult to put that into legislation. So at the end of the day, it's going to be left to the banks to determine. But at least there'll be some guidelines that might assist.
There's one last question I have too, because the next segment we have to deal with another issue, is that when I watched the Prime Minister, I can see he was quite happy when he said, that would be out of my hands, the central bank will handle that. But I was just thinking, after he said that, he is on the board of directors for the central bank.
Monetary Council, yes.
Yeah. Sorry?
On the Monetary Council.
Yeah, Monetary Council. So, I mean, how, it's to a certain extent, it's these members that make decisions. So
that's right.
It would fall back in his lap, not individually, but collectively. So
yeah, but here's, if the rest of the OECS prime ministers thought that our prime minister was a bleeding heart liberal, right, and wanted to protect everybody for whatever reason because he had an election coming up, they would overrule him.
Correct.
So it means that no one prime minister can introduce something that is clearly not responsible, and that's where he can safely say, well, under the circumstances, perhaps I wouldn't have done that, but I'm only one of many. Yeah.
Now, Richard, I think you've answered a lot of my concerns, because when I listened to the PM, I thought it was something that would actually take place much sooner.
No. Now, I said 2 to 3 years. That's not necessary to have all the legislation. They would like to expedite it, but it takes time to make sure you get the correct legislation. And the critical piece of legislation that they all will have to put in is an Insolvency Act. We don't have one at the moment. That Insolvency Act is now, it's in process. That could possibly be in place and enacted within a year. But the whole process of setting up the asset management companies, they're ready, and getting the rest of all of this into place is what, and then even if you had all of that, then starting to get the properties transferred and sold and whatnot, that's going to take a little bit of time. One critical thing, the insolvency legislation, if it's a good piece of legislation, and it exists, all over the world, there are many, many models, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. The whole idea of insolvency is a good piece of insolvency legislation is not just to give banks the freedom to take away assets from people who have borrowed and can't pay. It's the ability to allow people who have failed an opportunity to try again. Now, as you know from a person who I have very little respect for, Mr. Trump, has been in bankruptcy many, many times. And he's still a billionaire. Now, Chapter 11 in the state allows that. What it does is it gives a person in bankruptcy, with the instructions of a court, an opportunity to get a little bit of protection from his creditors while he tries to reorganize. And the chance of that working and getting back onto a stable footing is, I don't know the exact percentages, but it may be, let's call it a 30% chance of paying back.
It just helped American
Under
Airlines,
insolvency and liquidation, 90% of the times the asset gets sold, the business goes up. And so good insolvency legislation is in the best interest of our country. It will help those people who run into financial problems through sometimes no fault of their own, giving them an opportunity to restructure. If all else fails, then they will accept that they have to give up the asset, but at least it gives people another chance.
Yes. One last question before we close off, and that is, this fund which they're trying to create, they can put all the toxic assets in. I mean, who is going to should I say, foot the bill?
That was a good question.
Yeah,
and that
well, I'll tell you what,
yeah.
Junior has just given me a signal, so that is, we have just come to the end of the second segment of our program. We'll be right back.